This morning, George Osborne stepped out of this building behind me to deliver his fourth budget. Now, like all budgets, it was an attempt at magic to say he's giving away lots of money in tax cuts, he's raising lots of revenue, growth is going fantastically well, and his centrepiece was a massive tax cut for pensioners, which he reckons will net him more than £1 billion a year. So, is it too good to be true, and what tricks has he used to conjure up his budget today? Let's have a look. His story was a simple one, an economic recovery. And not just any old recovery, he told us, but
we are now growing faster than Germany, faster than Japan, faster than the United States.
So, is it true? If you take the growth at the end of last year, then yes, that's just if you count the G7. And crucially, if you take this year alone. Any country can grow a lot in 1 year. Rwanda's outpacing us right now. But George Osborne's problem is that this economic recovery comes after years of pretty slow to no growth. So on a per capita basis, it's not particularly impressive. So yes, we're growing quickly, but even now we're midway through the worst recovery in history. The crashes in the 90s, the 80s, and even the 1930s were shorter lived than this one. But today's figures show that, on a per capita basis, it's going to be about 2017 until we get back to where we were in 2008. That is, for Britain, a lost decade. So what's powering the recovery now? Skeptics might argue it's one thing alone, the debt. When you can go down to the bank and borrow at less than the rate of inflation, it looks like a pretty crazy system, but Britain isn't really recovering from its debt party. Yes, a lot of debt was run up in the Labour years. It went from a low of $310 billion to $504 billion. But today's budget show that the national debt will hit $1.4 trillion by 2017-18. This means that Osborne will have increased debt more in 5 years than Labour will have done in 13. It means his debt target will not be hit. And the cheap rates now mean that banks are falling over themselves to lend us cheap cash. But is this recovery being driven by the debt? Well, look at this chart. It shows economic growth and credit growth. This and this is the sign of credit-fueled growth. This, not so much. So these figures from Citibank suggest that Osborne does have reason to believe that, even though he is borrowing like a drunken Keynesian, his recovery is not a debt-fueled illusion. Of course, our Chancellor does like a bit of cheap debt. He today elaborated on his Help to Buy promise, where he'll lend money to home buyers, help fueling an already raging housing market. It's been extended to 2020, which makes economists nervous. This is what he had to say.
We're extending the Help to Buy equity loan scheme for the rest of the decade, so we get 120,000 new homes built.
In other words, a politician wants to help us out by intervening in the housing market. Now, where have we heard that before?
This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment.
So, George Osborne's policy is just a little bit of subprime lending. After all, what could possibly go wrong? But in today's budget, there was a serious piece of economic good news, and that's the jobs. When he took office, with these forecasts that now look so rosy, he imagined there would be 30 million people in work by the general election. That was some boast, given that he planned to cut 1.3 million public sector jobs. His idea at the time was written off by Ed Balls as sheer fantasy. Ed Balls was right. As things turned out, there are now likely to be 30.6 million jobs by the next election, better than the rosy forecasts. And unlike the Labour years, the majority of the jobs growth is now being accounted for by UK-born workers. More than 5 years after Gordon Brown came out with a soundbite, we're finally seeing British jobs for British workers. So let's look a bit more at what's gone so badly right. George Osborne glossed over it in the budget. He was so keen to get to his pensions finale. But as somebody from the Treasury told me a few weeks ago, even they don't seem to know what's going so right in the jobs market. That's funny because other people do. The Bank of England not so long ago identified benefit sanctions, Ian Duncan Smith's welfare crackdown, as one of the reasons why British people are now more inclined to look for work than stay on the welfare that it's more difficult to get your hands on. And then there's immigration. Theresa May has cracked down on the non-EU immigrants, and look at this chart. You can see a strange divergence in the number of EU immigrants finding work and the non-EU immigrants who don't seem to. Might that be related to the Home Office's crackdown on non-EU immigrants? And let's not forget real wages. They are not keeping pace with inflation. Look at this, perhaps the worst graph in the whole budget. It shows real earnings are not recovering to their 2008 peak. In fact, they're not likely to do so for years to come. This is, for people who are on salaries, which is the vast majority of us, 13 or maybe 15 years of hurt. It's going to be a long time before the average worker manages to get his earning power restored. But the pensions thing is without doubt the cornerstone of today. We don't have any graphs for that because this has until now been off the economic radar. People haven't really thought what would happen if you let people use their pension funds as a massive bank account, except George Osborne has. He's calculated that it's going to raise lots of money. It's going to raise him 320 million quid next year, 600 quid the year after, 910 million quid the year after that, and finally 1.2 billion quid in 2018-19. This is a tax cut which is netting in the Treasury money because the Treasury believes the pensioners will spend. As they work out what they want to buy, they may be more inclined to vote Tory. But what is the cost of all this? The reason why we've got limits on pension pots is to stop people running them down and relying on the state in later years. Will this happen? We don't know. How is George Osborne certain it won't happen? He isn't. It's a gamble, but a gamble which places faith in the ability of pensioners to manage their own pensions and those who aren't pensioners to make proper planning. Usually chancellors who bet on giving people more freedom do tend to win, but for George Osborne this could be the biggest gamble of his career. All told, this was, as you might expect, an electioneering budget from George Osborne. He's come up with something even Gordon Brown didn't think of. Get more money from pensioners by giving them more access to their pensions. The public finances are not that great shape, but he's hoping that the voters, a disproportionate number of whom are pensioners, will be too busy shopping to care.